Again, everyone, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day to be here. It's really nice to be with you all this evening. And today we're going to be talking about challenging your inner critic and what that means, what that looks like. We're going to go through an agenda. And yeah, we'll kind of go from there. So thanks again for being here. Oops. Okay. So just to introduce myself very briefly. So hi, my name is Monica. I'm a registered therapist here at Shift Collab. I'm a registered social worker, master of social work. And I've actually been with Shift Collab for 2 years exactly. I started in November of 2020. So it's been 2 years now. And yeah, I'm excited to be here with everyone today. Just to give you a brief background about me. So I support young adults managing stressful life transitions, anxiety, depression, and self-esteem challenges. So just to learn a little bit about my specialties, those are some of the main ones that come up with clients that I'm currently working with. So just to let you know about what tonight is going to consist of, my intention is to help you understand and manage your inner critic in a healthy way. So just to give a very brief background of who we are at Shift. So we are an integrated mental health firm. We offer therapy and training across Canada. We have a team of over 100 therapists and 12 support staff nationally. We support over 7,000 individuals through therapy and counseling. We've led over 400 workshops and trainings in the past 2 years for clients like LinkedIn, Shopify, Mabel, and many others. And we design and implement large-scale healthcare solutions and education programs like Maple's therapy service and high touch EAP alternatives. So Shift is always doing a lot. Hard for me to keep up sometimes because there's always something new, but that's a little bit more about what we do. So just a quick agenda of what today is going to look like. So first, we're going to go over what is an inner critic. I'm sure a lot of you have an idea of what exactly that is and what it could mean, but just to give you a brief background and definition. Then we're going to go over the origin and triggers of where your inner critic may be coming from. Sometimes it can be helpful to understand, the foundation of it, where it can be stemming from, just so we can further understand it and then know what to do with it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between an inner critic versus like an inner guide or, inner guidance type of perspective. Because I know that, internally there are a lot of voices that are always coming up. So we're going to try and be able to tell the difference between what's helpful and what's harmful and kind of take it from there. Once we have an understanding of what an inner critic exactly is, we're going to figure out, what do I do with this? How do I tackle negative thinking patterns coming up that are affecting my life more than I would probably like them to? So we're going to do that. And then we're going to talk about what are the benefits of doing that, right? So there's always a purpose and intention behind this. So we're going to talk about how tackling your inner critic and challenging those negative thought patterns can actually increase our productivity, our self-esteem, and our overall self-worth and self-perception. And then if we have time at the end, we're just going to do a really quick activity so that you have some takeaways and strategies from this webinar and understand how to do it independently of our time together today. Okay, so just to get started, we're going to talk about what exactly an inner critic is. And I also forgot to mention at the start, please feel free to keep your camera on or off, whatever is comfortable for you. This webinar is being recorded, but the chat box, which I can also access, is a safe space that's not being recorded. And also, if you do have your camera on, that's not being recorded either. It is separate, so please do whatever is comfortable for you, but I just wanted to let you know that in advance. So please feel free to speak up at any time. You don't have to raise your hand. You can unmute yourself and talk, or you can use the chat box. I'll be checking it every once in a while. Okay, so let's talk about what exactly is an inner critic. So just to give you a brief rundown of it, it's basically an internal voice that judges, demeans, and constantly criticizes a person, regardless of if the self-criticism can actually be justified. And it tends to focus on your problems, your faults, and your perceived shortcomings. So I put shortcomings in quotation marks because I think a lot of times, it's definitely not accurate, and what could be perceived as shortcomings most likely aren't, or if there are, mistakes and things that happen along the way, it's often amplified by by this inner critic. And with the inner critic, it often lacks the ability to focus on progress and success. So anyone, or all of us at some point who have experienced this very harsh and persistent negative voice is exactly that. It's very harsh, it's demeaning, and it's quite negative. It doesn't highlight any of the great qualities that we do have or successes and accomplishments that we do have in our books. And it often triggers feelings of shame, guilt, and fear as a way to attempt to promote change. So oftentimes with the inner critic, if we want to look at it from a more positive light, I think the intentions of it can be good. It does want some sort of change. It does want us to improve to some sort of extent, but unfortunately it comes from such a harsh perspective that it often ends up preventing us from changing and from growing in the ways that we would like to. So just the last point there, yeah, it often encourages like some form of self-sabotage because it is so harsh. So it ends up negatively affecting us in a way that was not intended to. So just to learn a little bit more about where exactly this comes from, because, I doubt that we all just woke up one day and this voice just kind of came up out of nowhere. It does have a foundation and a base. So like a lot of other things in life, the inner critic can be developed from our early childhood. So it could be a result of criticism, insults, and harsh remarks that could be made by family members, any sort of caregivers, peers, teachers, and friends growing up. So any sort of early relationships that we formed throughout our upbringing can all contribute towards our inner critic and how harsh it can be. And on the other hand of that, it doesn't mean that you had to be, bullied growing up, or have a traumatic childhood or anything like that. Even if you had that or didn't have that, the inner critic can still be present in a lot of other ways. And another way it can come up is based on witnessing our loved ones or people close to us that speak badly about themselves. So even if they're not talking badly directly to us, there's no criticism or insults towards us specifically. If we're often witnessing people talking down to themselves, then we kind of learn that behavior and we take on those patterns into our own lives. So it doesn't have to be a direct form. It can just be, again, through the ways in which we witness other people and their behavior towards themselves, which is why it's super important to check in with who you're surrounding yourself with, because it does directly have an impact on how you end up treating yourself as well. And again, yeah, we just sort of internalize the language that is either directly or indirectly given to us, and then kind of develops that inner critic as we get older. And it can kind of shift and change depending on life circumstances and experiences, but mostly it does get developed from a very young age. So as I mentioned when we first started, there is a difference between, the types of voices that do come up in our head. So the inner critic is the one I already mentioned, but there's also another one which is called like an inner guide or the inner guidance kind of perspective. And if I wanted to give like a synonym for that, I would say that's our gut and our intuitive voice. So we often have both, but if the inner critic is super strong and harsh, the gut and intuitive feelings often get very suppressed and diminished. But I just want to give you some reassurance that even if you feel like you haven't heard that voice in a while, it is still there, probably just on a deeper level, somewhat buried because of the intensity of the inner critic. So just to be able to tell the difference, if we're talking about like a gut and an intuitive voice, it often acknowledges our accomplishments, it validates our progress, it focuses on solutions and gratitude. So it will highlight your successes. It will have some sort of hope and optimism towards the future. It's also a lot more realistic and rational. So, when there's a lot of disastrous and anxious thinking, I think we can label that as the critic. Whereas when it's, like I said, less chaotic, it seems more balanced, it seems more neutral and rational, we can say that that's usually our gut and an intuitive voice. And there's often physical symptoms that present that can help us tell the difference. So with the critic, we can get a lot of physical symptoms of like racing heartbeat, sweating, feeling dizzy, feeling overwhelmed. Whereas if it's our gut and our intuitive voice, it tends to be like, we can take a deep breath, things make more sense, things seem more calm and peaceful. So just to, be able to tell the difference between the two, I think is really important, because when a voice comes up, we can either kind of label it as like, hey, this is an anxious and impulsive thought, or this is a gut and intuitive feeling that maybe I can try and resonate with more, as it's more likely to lead me in a positive direction that I want to be going in. So now that I've given a little bit of background about, what an inner critic is, how it originates, and kind of the difference between that and a gut and intuitive perspective, I'm curious if anyone feels comfortable sharing what are some comments that your inner critic has said to you. So you can feel free to unmute yourself, or if you want to use the chat box, I will keep my eye on it right now. But yeah, if anyone feels comfortable sharing, and if you're thinking of, what an example of that could be, it could be, really harsh yet simple things like, you're a failure, you're meaningless, you're never going to succeed in this. Seeing some messages come up. You are just not good enough. You can do better. It's not going to work out. No one will ever love you. Why even try? I'm not good enough. You deserve this bad thing. They probably hate you. You're not lovable, not smart enough. You're a disappointment. I'm an imposter. Wow. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So definitely resonating with all of these. Why are you so lazy? Yep. Imposter, lazy, disappointment, not lovable, not smart. They probably hate you. Yeah. So as I'm reading all of these out, I know like I'm even feeling it in my body of like these are so mean. Honestly, I don't even know if there's a better word for that, but they're so mean. And based on the responses, I'm seeing that yeah, like we are all experiencing this to the same degree of intensity at times. And yeah, these statements are just so final, right? And kind of making conclusions about our identity that are most likely not accurate and not representative of our realities. So, yeah, definitely resonate with all of these. You will never make it. Yep. Mhm. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone who felt comfortable enough to share these. This is super helpful. And I hope everyone feels like a level of reassurance in me reading everyone else's comments, just to know that, you're not alone. We all have this very harsh and mean voice that comes through sometime. And nothing wrong with you, just something that we need to learn to manage and get under control. Otherwise, it can take on a mind of its own, which can be really scary. So thank you so much for everyone who shared. If anyone wants to share later, feel free to put it in the chat and I will read it again later. And this was just an image I came across. I thought it was like a great representation of what the inner critic looks like in a picture. I kind of like, how the person's like kind of like slumped over and they're hunched. It just feels like they're carrying so much weight of honestly fighting with yourself. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to go through because it's not even, somebody telling you these things, it's your own self telling you it. And I think that can be really difficult to just have all these opposing thoughts in your head. And it can feel really isolating as well because it's all an internal process that you're working through. So I just thought this picture could be an accurate representation of what your inner critic could look like and the impact that it has on you and your body, physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I hope that resonates with somebody because I know it definitely resonated with me in this image. So now that we talked a little bit about what an inner critic is and some examples of what that actually sounds like for us, now let's talk about how do I challenge it? What does that actually look like for me to take like actionable items towards talking back to my inner critic and hopefully quieting it down a little bit when it needs some quiet downtime. So there were 5 main points that I wanted to discuss today. The first one being self-awareness of our thoughts. So when we're talking about this, I think with our inner critic and with the negative voices that are coming up in our head, it's really easy to just let them talk. We don't really acknowledge them, but we're not dismissing them at the same time. We're kind of letting it paint a picture for us. We're letting it narrate and continue to just say comment after comment after comment. And we're just kind of like, yeah, I hear you, and trying to go about our day. But it's really hard to focus when it's, constantly bombarding us time and time again with all of these really rude and mean and harsh comments. So a first step of, how do I challenge and talk back to my inner critic is being self-aware of what it's actually saying. So it's about taking that extra step of being self-aware and saying, okay, when this thought comes up, I'm going to record it somewhere. I'm going to write it down on a sheet of paper. I'm going to make a note in my phone. I'm going to even draw a picture, maybe if you're a really visual person, of what this thought represents, whatever that looks like for you. But that first step is to record it somewhere. And why I say this is the first step and why it could be really helpful is because once we have all of these thoughts on a piece of paper, I think it's really shocking for a lot of people to recognize, I just recorded what my voice was saying for 5 minutes and I have a list of 10, really mean judgments and comments that it made. So there's almost like that reality check and like that shock factor of like, whoa, like this is a lot of stuff. Similar to the chat box, I was reading all of them come up, and oops. I was reading all of them come up and I was like, that was shocking for me as well, right? And I'm sure some of you were like, wow, like, all these thoughts are kind of coming up for us at the exact same time. And it's really bombarding and it's really overwhelming. So I'm just going to read something that came up in the chat. I love the worry time. It's made such a difference for me to at least not feel overpowered by my critic in that moment. Absolutely. And that brings me to my next point, which is setting a time to worry. So this is essentially, if we want to look at it from like an imagery kind of perspective, is like a container exercise, right? So when we're recognizing the inner critic and the very harsh and negative thoughts coming forward, is there a way that we can set a time to let ourselves spiral and let ourselves worry and engage with these thoughts? Because it's really difficult if, you don't put a boundary with your inner critic. If you're just letting it talk from 9 to 5 every single day when you're at work, and then it's coming up at night when you're trying to enjoy your evening, whatever the situation is, then it's really, it's unhinged. It's just coming forward whenever it wants. So setting a time to worry is helpful of like, okay, every evening from 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m., I'm going to let my inner critic come forward. I'm going to let it honestly purge myself of those thoughts is like a key kind of phrase that comes to mind for me. I'm going to let myself worry. I'm going to let myself spiral and catastrophize, but only in that 30-minute time frame. So like I said, I really like the word kind of like purging for that, or releasing the tension of the buildup of all of those thoughts. And I think it helps with setting a boundary. That way, if the critic is coming up earlier in the day, kind of keeping it in check and saying, I scheduled a time for you at 6 p.m. tonight. We have an appointment then, but I can't attend to you right now because I'm at school, or I'm focusing on work, or I'm doing nothing. You don't even need to be doing anything to have an excuse. Your time is your time, does not need to be overpowered by the inner critic. So that's kind of the second piece there. So self-awareness of the thoughts, labeling them, writing them all out, just so you can see a visual representation of the frequency of these thoughts coming out. Second piece is setting a time to worry. Once we recognize how prominent and frequent these thoughts are, can we schedule a structured time in order to kind of release and purge these thoughts that are coming forward from the inner critic? The third piece that I want to talk about is examining the facts and the evidence, right? So even in the chat box, like again, a lot of these very mean and harsh comments here, I pretty much can guarantee are extremely inaccurate and not representative of all of your realities. You are way more than these comments that you brought forward, right? So when we're identifying the thoughts, when we're acknowledging them, I think it's important to check in, well, are there facts and evidence to support and prove this thought to be true? And, maybe there are some things that have happened that can make us say, yeah, that actually does support why my inner critic is saying it. And I don't want to challenge that. I don't want to invalidate that. I think that's totally fair. But is that the whole truth, right? So it's just like, if we're trying to prove the case of this thought, would we win the case? Maybe there are some facts and evidence, but I guarantee it's not enough to say, this is the whole truth. For example, somebody mentioned like, I'm unlovable. So maybe you can think of a time where, yes, I did feel unlovable, or somebody really hurt me. And, validating that is extremely important. But is that enough to make such a final statement and say that I'm unlovable in general? Or can we say, somebody in my life made me feel unlovable at that point in time, but that's not representative of my future, not necessarily representative of my present either. Maybe I'm holding on to something from the past. So really just working to challenge these thoughts of, do they have facts and evidence to support them and even saying that? And are they really true? Is it a comprehensive picture of your identity and who you are? Most of the time it's not, just because, like I said, the finality of these sentences, and it often engages in a very like black and white type of thinking, which we know like our entire lives is based in like some kind of gray area or middle ground. So if it is an all or nothing thinking, just checking in with, how accurate is that really? Um, and then once we've kind of examined the facts and evidence and realized that maybe this isn't the whole truth, can we replace the critical thought with a more accurate statement? So kind of like the example I gave with the comment of like, I'm just an unlovable person and there's nothing I can do about it. Can we replace the thought and say, again, in this situation, I felt unlovable. Somebody triggered this for me. However, I'm not unlovable for everybody. Not everybody perceives me in that way. And again, it is not representative of what my future holds as well. I think that's a big piece as well, because we start spiraling and thinking, things that have happened to us in the past are going to happen again in the future. And really, they could be extremely mutually exclusive and have nothing to do with each other, but we try and tie those connections together. So that's kind of the fourth piece of, can we just make the thought more neutral? Can we make the thought more rational? I'm not someone on the other end of the spectrum who's like, be super optimistic and positive and ignore things that are happening to you, because I think that's invalidating yourself. But can we find some gray area and some middle ground? That's like the key of like leaning towards the middle of the spectrum, I think is really important. And the fifth kind of strategy towards challenging our inner critic revolves around writing a letter to this inner judge. So I've used this with clients before who have given me great feedback and said it's super helpful to kind of write a letter to yourself, to the inner judge and the inner critic, almost like a gratitude letter of saying, thank you for bringing up these concerns. I appreciate that you're trying to look out for me, but it's not helpful in the way that you're going about it, right? Kind of like if you have a friend or somebody who's, trying to help you, but they're coming about it in a way that's like super aggressive or rude or not helpful, you can understand the intention behind it. I appreciate your concern. However, the way in which you're talking to me is not working. Is there a way that we can readjust it? So it's almost like trying to write a letter as if it was a person, right? And saying, I appreciate it, but is there another way that we can go about it? And a lot of people report just feeling like a sense of release, a reduction of tension there of, I shared this letter and now it's kind of out of my system. Just seeing something come up in the chat. I love the letter idea. It's kind of like making peace with the inner critic. Exactly. And that is the intention of just to, show your gratitude, show your thankfulness. Like I said earlier, I think the inner critic does come from, it can come from a positive place of, it does want you to change, but the way in which it goes about it is obviously not helpful. So I think the gratitude piece is important of like, it's coming up for a reason. It's trying to help me. I just don't like the way that, that it's going about it. So that's kind of the 5 strategies. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about it at this point? If you do, please just leave a message in the chat and I will attend to it after. So if anything comes up, just feel free to put it there. I also set aside sometimes for questions. So if anything comes to mind. So now that we've kind of talked about, strategies of how to tackle the inner critic, I think it's important just to remind you of why you're here in the first place, why you're at this webinar and why it matters. So there is a lot of power in our thoughts. There's a lot of power in our inner dialogue. I think that our thoughts are the foundation of everything, which then affect our moods, behaviors, attitudes, and actions. And if we create certain narratives cognitively and internally, it does eventually become our reality. So if we work to challenge the inner critic and try and make it more of our friend, or try and make it in a way that resonates with the inner guidance instead, and like the gut and the intuitive feelings, it does have a direct impact on our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-perception, also our productivity levels. I don't know if anyone's kind of seen the connection there, but going back to this idea, if we don't have any boundaries set with the inner critic and we're just letting it bark at us 24/7, it's really hard to be productive. It's really hard to give attention where you'd like to be during your day and focus, because so much of the attention is just focused in our head and whatever is going on there. So it does affect your productivity levels if, again, inner critic is super loud, super prominent, and we're not scheduling a time to kind of release the tension as like an appointment. If we're letting this go all day, does affect the productivity levels. And then it also affects, like I said, attitudes, actions, and behaviors, because we have this perceived narrative and reality of who we are. Even if it is super inaccurate, we will start kind of manifesting those things to end up happening, which then affects our connections to others, right? So I keep going back to the comment of the unlovable one, because if you truly believe that about yourself, then you're going to isolate yourself. You're going to feel like there's no point in me connecting with other people if I'm unlovable. And then that eventually does become our reality, where we are isolated from others and cutting other people off because of our belief and the ways in which we're resonating with the inner critic. So I just wanted to remind everyone of, like, why this is so important, why you're here in the first place, and why it can be helpful to do the work, because you can reap the benefits of it. And this is a constant thing. This isn't something that you do once and you kind of achieve the goal and that's it. The inner critic is always there, and like I said, not necessarily a bad thing if we can kind of gain some control over it and understand why it's coming from, where it's coming from, and why it's coming up. So we do have some time for an activity. So it's really quick, and this is something that you can definitely do on your own time as well. But really, I just want you to take some time to, identify an area in your life where your inner critic is very vocal. So maybe it's at work, school, relationships, friends, maybe just when you're spending time alone, and it's often like just about, your self-image, for example. So if we think about an area where it's very persistent, listening to that inner critic for a couple minutes. So if there's anything coming to mind right now of like, oh, every time I go to work, this thought comes up, and it's like extremely harsh and negative and persistent. The activity encourages you to write down what your inner critic is telling you about this, right? So you can kind of ask your inner critic the following questions after you've kind of reflected on what it's saying, and write down the answers of, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want from me? Are you afraid of what might happen if I don't listen to you? So it's kind of similar to the letter strategy, but this one is a little bit more quick, of like, we're writing down what the inner critic is telling us about the area of our life where it's most persistent, and we're just asking 3 basic questions. So again, this is an activity that you can kind of do now on the spot, just really quickly to check in. And also, doing this on your own time for sure. If you feel like, okay, I don't have an hour to write a letter to my inner critic, can I just do this quickly on the spot? Just getting a chat. Work 100%. I am my own worst critic in what I do or what I execute. Absolutely. So I think this activity could definitely be helpful there. Of again, like, quick 60-second check-in, asking these 3 questions, what's coming up for you, right? So it's just to understand the intention and purpose of why this is coming up in the first place and why it's very meaningful. So yeah, please, I hope this activity is helpful. If there's any questions or concerns or comments about it, feel free to use the chat function as always. Yeah, and I think we're wrapping up with like pretty perfect time. So I just wanted to check in if anyone had any questions, whether it was about the activity or any of the other slides. Yeah, or any comments or feedback. Thank you so much for coming.